Hello, friends. How many Russian soldiers have died over 4 years of war? It is an important and difficult question, and judging by the recent poll, many of you would be interested in knowing the answer. Information about the Soviet dead in Afghanistan had a serious impact on the fall of the USSR, and after the end of the Second World War, it took the leadership 2 decades to finally admit the real scale of the losses. So what price is Russia paying for the war in Ukraine? Putin often speaks as if he deeply cares about preserving the country's human capital.
Сбережение народа, о котором говорил Солженицын, является одной из важнейших задач и одним из драйверов роста.
But that concern exists only in words. In reality, for 4 years now, every single day of this war has been taking the lives of Russian men. But how many exactly? These numbers are never voiced by Putin, despite all his talk about caring for the people. Other officials hide this information as well. All we really have are estimates of the losses, and they vary wildly. Some speak of tens of thousands, others of millions. So let's take a closer look. Let's start with the most conservative estimates. We will not use the official Russian figures, because those still stand at 1,351 killed and 3,825 wounded, and they have not been updated since September 2022. There is a named list of the dead compiled by Mediazona and the BBC Russian service. As of the end of March 2026, it includes just over 206,000 killed. These are the most reliable figures we have, and they are updated every 2 weeks. They are based on obituaries and inheritance records. Many of the dead have photographs, and for almost all of them, the date of birth is known. The average age of those killed is 37. There are very few serious grounds to doubt this data. Moreover, these are exactly the figures that major international media outlets regularly cite. But for example, the Canadian YouTuber History Legends, in one of his recent videos on a similar topic, mentioned Mediazona and the BBC Russian service as sources that supposedly should not be trusted. He also claimed that these people are probably Ukrainians collecting data on Russian losses. That is simply not true. This work is carried out mostly by Russian citizens, many of whom are now facing criminal cases in Russia itself. As evidence for his distrust, the blogger pointed to 4 examples from the data published on the site. But as it turned out, only one of those cases actually involved an incorrect link. In the other cases, he seems to have misunderstood the context, most likely because of the language barrier. Mediazona editor Dmitry Treshchanin addressed this in more detail on Twitter and also released a separate video with a full breakdown. And in general, with a dataset of this size, isolated mistakes are completely normal. What matters more is that the authors of the project openly ask people to contact them if they find inaccuracies, and they correct such errors quickly. Ironically, in that same exchange, Dmitry found an error in the data presented on the Canadian blogger's own resource. If you are interested, I can make a separate video later about this small dispute. But I decided to mention it here because some of you may also watch History Legends, and in that case, this clarification is important, because these criticisms, to put it mildly, look baseless, and a source like Mediazona together with the BBC Russian service can absolutely be considered authoritative when it comes to counting Russian losses. At least, that is how I see it. Let's return to that official count of confirmed losses. More than 206,000 dead is almost the entire population of cities like Angarsk, Nizhnekamsk, or Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. That is many times higher than the total Soviet losses in Afghanistan over 10 years of war, or Russia's losses in the Second Chechen War. In fact, it is greater than the losses in all wars involving Soviet and Russian forces after World War II. Olga Ivshina, one of the correspondents of the BBC Russian service, pointed out several striking details while working with this data. First, each new year of the war has become more and more deadly. That is why 2025 turned out to be the worst year yet in terms of losses. Second, losses noticeably increased during periods of international activity or negotiations. In fact, Neither Ushakov nor Peskov really tried to hide this. They openly said that the military situation plays an important role in negotiations, which means that, in order to strengthen Russia's position, people were thrown into battle even more intensely. And finally, the third detail Olga noticed while helping build this resource together with Mediazona was this. It became obvious that Putin was drawing disproportionately heavily from Russia's smaller ethnic groups. If you look not at the absolute numbers, but at losses per capita, in other words, at what share of a particular people has been killed, then among the worst affected are the peoples of Kamchatka and Siberia. There is one more trend that sociologists working with Olga also noticed. Again, if you look at the numbers per capita, those going off to fight in Ukraine most often come from small settlements where dependence on state subsidies and budget-funded jobs is especially high. If a person in Moscow could lose a job and still find another one, then in remote settlements surviving largely on support from the federal center, the choice to go to war and earn money there for one's children or family did not seem like such a bad option. I would actually strongly recommend visiting their website if this topic interests you, and also taking a look at their recently added map of Russia, where all of these losses can be traced visually. For example, you can see how many people went to war from the very south of Russia, from the west, the east, and the north. Even in my own region, I found a couple of familiar names of people who have already been killed. And by the way, this is not only a map of Russia. The creators also tried to geolocate those who were recruited into the war from Kazakhstan, as well as those who came to fight from regions of Georgia where Moscow-backed puppet regimes are in place, meaning Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and from the occupied parts of Ukraine, including those who were mobilized or recruited during the war itself. These lists also include a certain number of Ukrainian citizens, including prisoners. For example, Ukrainian citizens who, at the start of the war, were serving sentences in Russian prisons. There are also Ukrainian citizens who ideologically enlisted in the Russian army. And in fact, this map gives a huge amount of insight into this war. It offers a much clearer understanding of how the Russian army replenishes its ranks, where people are being recruited from, and from where they are being sent off to war. But it seems that even such detailed counts are still a conservative estimate. By tracking inheritance cases, it is possible to estimate excess male mortality. According to Mediazona, as of the end of August 2025, this methodology points to 219,000 dead. That is already roughly the population of Veliki Novgorod, but even that figure appears incomplete. A new American study by the Center for Strategic and International Studies points to much higher losses. According to it, Russia has suffered a total of 1.2 million casualties over the 4 years of war. That is more than any major power has lost in a war since World War II. It is a horrifying number, roughly the population of an entire city like Krasnoyarsk, Nizhny Novgorod, or Ufa. Friends, now is the perfect moment to hit the like button. And don't forget to share this video with your friends. Thank you. Of course, that figure includes not only the dead, but also the wounded and the missing. As for those directly killed, the study estimates between 275,000 and 325,000 deaths. These figures are based on the same named list compiled by Mediazona and the BBC Russian service, as well as information from Western intelligence services. There is another way to estimate Russian losses, not by looking at deaths, but by looking at recruitment numbers. And that is exactly what some pro-war Z channels have recently tried to do. According to their calculations, around 540,000 contract soldiers were recruited in 2023. In 2024, another 440,000. In 2025, another 400,000. And on top of that, there are at least 300,000 mobilized troops. These are not people recruited to serve in the rear or guard the border. These are people recruited specifically to fight in Ukraine. That gives us a total of nearly 1.7 million people. And yet, according to Putin himself, there are now about 1 million fewer troops at the front, just 700,000. Ultra-patriots are asking, where did that million go? And perhaps the real gap is closer to 1.5 million, if you also count those who had signed contracts before the war began. One might assume that this missing million has already returned home. But no, once again, even the Kremlin's own official figures say otherwise. Only 167,000 servicemen have returned home to civilian life. There is, however, another estimate. Inside the Kremlin itself, Sergei Novikov, the head of the Presidential Directorate for Public Projects, stated that at least 250,000 had not only returned from the front, but were also now sitting unemployed in civilian life. Later, his words were quietly scrubbed, apparently so as not to alarm the public. So if we take even the Kremlin's own numbers seriously, it turns out that by the most conservative estimate, nearly 800,000 people have somehow vanished into this war. At this point, that alone practically sounds like grounds for a criminal case for discrediting the army. After all, even NATO's estimates of Russian losses are lower. Perhaps this also includes the losses of the Russian-controlled forces from occupied Donetsk and Luhansk, which are usually left out of the official count. It is obvious that Putin does not care about these people. Yes, he poses for the cameras with veterans, with the wounded and the maimed, but that is public relations. If he truly cared, he would not be throwing them into meat assaults by the tens of thousands. He has no pity for those killed in this war. But what about basic cold calculation for the country? These hundreds of thousands of men, with an average age of 37, are exactly the people the Russian economy is missing right now. Russia has record low unemployment, around 2%, and no matter how proudly Putin talks about that number, it is actually a deeply alarming figure. It does not mean everything is going well. It means there is no one left to work. Moscow alone is short 500,000 workers. A year ago, the government estimated the shortage of qualified labor at 1.5 million people. No updated figures have appeared since then, but you do not need to be a genius to understand that the situation has not improved. By 2030, the labor shortage is expected to grow to 2 million people, and that is without even taking battlefield losses into account. It is not as if the authorities do not understand the problem. Take a government meeting, for example. They talk about labor shortages, they discuss solutions, decisions are made. Needless to say, none of those decisions involve stopping the war. That is the elephant in the room everyone is terrified to mention. No, the proposed solution is something else. Replace the labor shortage with artificial intelligence and raise wages.
Здесь нужно более активно внедрять автоматические системы и промышленные роботы, цифровые платформы и решения в области искусственного интеллекта.
I'm a fan of artificial intelligence myself, but first of all, you don't actually have it. Sanctions. So neither ChatGPT, nor Gemini, nor Grok is going to be handed over for domestic use in the way Russia likes to imagine. Something fully its own, fully under control. And Russia's own AI development has already fallen behind the global leaders, perhaps permanently. Second, it is not lawyers, accountants, or screenwriters that Russia needs to replace. It needs workers in industry, in services, in construction. At this point, it would be easier to replace government ministers with artificial intelligence than ordinary workers. And the promise to raise wages is little more than empty rhetoric. The money is still going to the war. The Kremlin's priority is to pay high salaries to soldiers and to pay compensation for wounds and deaths. It is precisely through this flood of money that the state pulls people away from the civilian labor market and sends them to the front. But if wages are raised in civilian jobs, then the flow of new contract soldiers will fall. And that would mean military pay would have to be raised again. It is a vicious circle. And then there are the specific people at the center of all this, the hundreds of thousands of men under 40 who have been killed in this senseless war in Ukraine. That is the median age of Russians. These are the very people who form the backbone of the country's demographic future, and there is no one to replace them. These are people born in the 1980s, the last decade in Russia's history, when women were still having roughly 2 children on average. By 1999, for example, the fertility rate had fallen to 1.1. Russia is already trapped in a very deep demographic hole, and with this war, Putin is burying the country even deeper. Instead of protecting the working-age population, he is luring it to the front with high salaries and sending it towards certain death. And death there really is all too certain. European intelligence services estimate that around 30,000 to 35,000 Russian soldiers are being taken out of action every month, killed or maimed. That is roughly the same number Russia manages to recruit each month. The state's demographic policy is an endless parade of hypocrisy. Putin constantly talks about demography. The country is waging a campaign against abortions. People are being pushed toward large families. The state pays maternity capital. That is one side of it. And on the other side, Putin is feeding hundreds of thousands of men into the meat grinder in Ukraine. Men who could have started families and raised children, but instead are killing for money, with every chance of dying in the next assault for yet another supposedly liberated village with maybe 5 houses left in it. And all of this is happening while, even without any war, Russia's population had already been shrinking by about 500,000 people a year. You may not remember, or may simply never have known, that in May 1999, the State Duma tried to impeach Yeltsin. One of the accusations against him was genocide against the Russian people. Back in 1999, that accusation was clearly far-fetched. That is partly why, despite the parliament being opposed to Yeltsin, the impeachment failed. What Putin is doing now is real genocide against his own people. Just think about it. Some of the young men now being sent to the front were 14 years old when this war began. It is a total nightmare. Putin is waging an aggressive and unjust war against Ukraine, but the result of this war will be a catastrophe for Russia as well, regardless of whatever formal outcome may eventually be declared on the battlefield. Friends, thank you for being here and for continuing to support me. If you like what I do and want to support the channel, you're welcome to join my Patreon, where for just $3 a month you get access to new videos 24 hours before they go public, posts, polls, and also exclusive videos. For example, this shocking story about Russia's Black Widows, women who marry soldiers and wait for death payouts. I also want to say a huge thank you to everyone who supports me through Buy Me a Coffee. It's thanks to my supporters that I can keep doing this work and keep moving toward my goal, saving up for my education in Europe. If you want to support me in this, I've created a page where I explain in detail how much money I need, what it will be used for, and what you'll receive in return for your help. The link is in the description. If I manage to raise at least half of the total goal, I'll already be able to start preparing the documents for a student visa. Right now, I have 99 incredible patrons. Please, let's hit 100. Not saying goodbye. See you very soon.